The Trans-Mississippi Theater, that is the theater of the U.S. Civil War that was fought west of the Mississippi River, is a relatively forgotten theater of that war. But of course, the resources in the West were so vast that control of them could swing the tide of the war. And so, in the fall of 1864, when a Confederate army of some 14,000 troops under the command of Major General Sterling Price attempted to capture the state of Missouri for the Confederacy, it represented a very real threat to the Union, even if some in the Union were slow to recognize that threat. The October 23rd, 1864 Battle of Westport was the largest battle of the U.S. Civil War to be fought west of the Mississippi River. It was a battle steeped in politics, in which many famous men participated, and that, some say, turned on a stolen horse. The Gettysburg of the West deserves to be remembered. The U.S. Civil War has been said to have been a war of brother against brother, and nowhere was that more true than the contested border state of Missouri, a slave state that had significant populations of both Union and Confederate sympathizers. Some historians have described the Civil War in Missouri, which included both major battles and bloody guerrilla campaigns, as a war within a war, fought by neighbor against neighbor. For being a part of the relatively forgotten Trans-Mississippi Theater, the war was very real in Missouri. The website Travel in Missouri notes that more than 1,200 distinct engagements of varying size were fought within Missouri between 1861 and 1865, a total exceeded only by the states of Virginia and Tennessee. And it is perhaps no surprise that the largest of those was precipitated by a former governor of the state. Sterling Price was born in Virginia in 1809, studied law, and moved with his family to Missouri in 1830. His family was moderately prosperous, and he served in the state legislature. He briefly commanded militia during the 1838 Missouri Mormon War, and returned to the legislature and was Speaker of the House of Representatives. And then in 1844 was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He served as a brigadier general during the war with Mexico, which earned him political capital that he used to be elected governor in 1852, serving until 1857. At the outbreak of the war in 1861, Missouri declined to secede, but attempted to maintain neutrality. Still, the governor, Claiborne Fox Jackson, and former Governor Price harbored Confederate sympathies. The state raised a military force called the Missouri State Guard, and Jackson gave command of the force to Price. While ostensibly created to defend Missouri's neutrality, the Guard would serve alongside the Confederacy, although it was never officially a formation of the Confederate States Army. The Guard, alongside Confederate units, won a victory against Union forces at the August 1861 Battle of Wilson's Creek, but attempts by Confederates to gain control of Missouri were dashed with defeat in the March 1862 Battle of Pea Ridge, both subjects of other episodes of the History Guy. Price was commissioned a major general in the Confederate States Army, served as commander of the District of Tennessee, but by 1863 was back in the Trans-Mississippi. Late 1864 looked bleak for the Confederacy. A publication of the Division of Parks and Historic Preservation of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources for Fort Davidson State Historical Site explains. By the summer of 1864, the fiery campaign of the Confederate States of America was on the verge of being snuffed out. East of the Mississippi River, General Ulysses S. Grant's Federal Army had the Southern Army of General Robert E. Lee under siege and pinned down in Virginia. Another force under William Tecumseh Sherman had sidestepped the Confederacy's tough Western Army and was marching through Georgia to threaten Atlanta. After Grant's successful Vicksburg campaign, the Union had full control of the Mississippi River. Sherman was on the march, and Lee was tied down defending Richmond. The Confederate Army in the Trans-Mississippi, under the command of General Edmund Kirby Smith, found itself cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, unable to assist Lee's Army of Northern Virginia or General Joseph Johnston's Army of Tennessee, as Federal gunboats made it impossible to cross the Mississippi. Moreover, the Division of Parks and Historical Preservation explains, Smith did not wish to risk his limited forces. They continue. In July of 1864, Kirby Smith received orders to send his best infantry units east for the relief of Georgia and Alabama. Fearful of losing command of his infantry, Smith notified President Jefferson Davis that he was making plans for a major Western campaign, which would be stymied by the loss of his infantry. By August, Davis deferred to Smith, and not a single rifleman was ever sent across the Mississippi to the aid of Atlanta. The threatened loss of his infantry forced Smith to hastily arrange a raid into Arkansas and Missouri. Even if the underlying motive was to keep Smith's infantry in the Trans-Mississippi, the raid had purpose. In his 1906 book, The Battle of Westport, author Paul Burrell Jenkins explains, Price and his officers brought much pressure on Smith to entrust the army to them and send it at once into Missouri. They advanced the claims that this move would compel the federal government to divert a large part of their eastern forces into Missouri to meet it, and would thus affect the Union cause in both West and East, weakening Sherman, Grant, and Thomas, setting Lee and Johnson correspondingly freer from opposition and possibly adding enormously to the strength of the Confederacy by the seizure of Missouri and eastern Kansas. As a further motive, it was hoped that capturing Missouri for the Confederacy might help swing U.S. public opinion against Lincoln in the 1864 election. Price, as a former governor with deep connections in the state, was given command of the newly constituted Army of Missouri. Despite his promises to Davis, Kirby Smith did not send any of his infantry on the expedition. Price's 3 divisions were all under strength. Jenkins explains, "It should be understood that many of these regiments were in reality but handfuls of men, probably not one numbering anything like full strength." Jenkins concludes that all in all, Price started with close to 10,000 men, all of whom were mounted. In addition, Price had with him 14 artillery pieces. But Price had been in communication with Confederate sympathizers throughout Missouri and southern Illinois, and expected to receive not just substantial material aid, but thousands of volunteers. The Missouri Department of Parks and Historical Preservation explains, Kirby Smith had another idea to bolster the force. On his way north through Arkansas, Brigadier General Joseph Shelby, in command of one of Price's divisions, was ordered to round up as many deserters as possible from behind the Union lines. Shelby rejoined Price's army near the Missouri border, bringing with him more than 3,000 deserters at gunpoint to serve in the Great Campaign. Deserters eventually were to make up nearly a third of Price's force. While he had some quality troops, much of his force was what Civil War historian Albert Castell called in his 1994 book, General Sterling Price and the Civil War in the West, military riffraff. While Price's force would eventually be joined by a few thousand men from bands of Confederate guerrillas, the expected thousands of reinforcements from Confederate sympathizers never materialized. His force would be facing the federal forces of both Major General William Rosecrans' Department of Missouri and a hastily formed Army of the Border, composed of militia units from the Federal Department of Kansas, under the command of Major General Samuel Curtis. Among his troops, Curtis employed a 27-year-old civilian scout who reported on Confederate movements. His name was James Butler Hickok. Entering Missouri on September 19th, Price fought a violent action against a federal force of 1,500 men under the command of Brigadier General Thomas Ewing, defending Fort Davidson, south of St. Louis, on the 27th. Price took nearly 1,000 casualties, making frontal assaults on the outnumbered defenders of the fort, who were able to withdraw that evening. While the Confederates won the battle, forcing the Federals to retire, Price took significant casualties, and the battle demonstrated the weakness of many of his troops. The Federal position was actually weaker than it appeared, with forces of mostly militia spread across the state, but his losses at Fort Davidson convinced Price that St. Louis was too well defended for his force to take, and he turned towards the capital of Jefferson City instead. While Price defeated Federal forces in small actions, these served to delay him while the Federals collected their forces. Rosecrans was gathering militia and dispatched his cavalry under the command of General Alfred Pleasonton to harry Price's march. Price moved slowly, hampered by his supply train, and by the time he reached Jefferson City on October 5th, the Federals had gathered their forces there. Castell writes, "At noon, the Confederates occupied the hills overlooking Jefferson City on the south. In plain sight was the Capitol, the stars and stripes waving atop its dome. But also visible were 5 forts and long lines connecting rifle pits, all heavily manned and protected by palisades." Convinced that he was outmatched, Price gave up on Jefferson City and decided to move west, hoping to take Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Again, his forces fought and won some small victories, capturing supplies, but delaying his advance while the Federals gathered their troops. But the Union also faced issues. Much of the Kansas militia in Curtis's Army of the Border initially refused to leave Kansas, and only finally relented when it became clear that Price threatened their homes as well. And command structures were confused by orders that militia units could only be led by militia officers. An advance guard under the command of James Blunt made a stout defense at the crossing of Little Blue River east of Independence on October 21st. Blunt was eventually forced to withdraw, but again Price was delayed. By now, Curtis had gathered nearly 15,000 men, and Pleasonton's 4,500 cavalry continued their pursuit, as well as 9,000 infantry from the quickly reinforced Department of Missouri. Among Pleasonton's force was the 7th Kansas Cavalry Regiment, and serving in that regiment was an 18-year-old private and teamster by the name of William Frederick Cody. Also with Pleasonton, 40-year-old John Johnson served as a private in the 2nd Colorado Cavalry. Realizing his plight, Price was determined to try and defeat Curtis and Pleasonton in detail before they could join together. Price forced a crossing at the Big Blue River on October 22nd and met Curtis's army outside the town of Westport, just outside Kansas City, on the 23rd. Castell writes, "Sunday, October 23rd, dawned clear and cold. The initial part of the battle engaged Blunt's troops defending along Brush Creek against attacks by Confederates under the command of Shelby. Of the fighting along Brush Creek, Castle writes, both sides charged and countercharged repeatedly, and both suffered severe losses. Shelby finally forced Blunt back, but almost out of ammunition, was forced to delay. Curtis counterattacked, but was stymied by the Confederate defense of the creek. But then, by chance, he ran into a farmer named George Toman. In his 1994 book, Action Before Westport, historian Thomas Mannott explains, Toman came up to Major General Curtis and offered to show him a defile that led to the plain just south of the heights of 55th and Ward Parkway. Confederate soldiers had stolen his gray mare along with some hams and tableware the night before. Concerned for the mare, the farmer had gotten to look for her that Sunday morning and had wandered into the Union lines. The defile was a narrow gulch cut out by Swan Creek that flowed from the southwest down the hill into Brush Creek. Curtis was able to bring a battery of artillery through the gulch to open fire on the Confederate flank, allowing the Union to gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, Pleasanton had arrived in Price's rear and, in another brutal action, forced back Price's rear guard under Major General John Marmaduke and claimed control of the ford of Big Blue Creek. When Colonel Edward Winslow of Pleasanton's 4th Brigade was wounded in the fight, he was succeeded by Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Benteen. Trapped between converging Federal forces, Price's army started to fall back. At one point, an Arkansas cavalry regiment under the command of Colonel James McGee charged a battery of Union artillery, hoping to capture the guns. Quick action by 2 squadrons of the 15th Kansas Cavalry under the command of Captain Curtis Johnson countercharged. Historian Paul Jenkins described the fight in his 1906 book, The Battle of Westport. The 2 masses of horsemen met at full speed, and a short but fierce fight followed. As the 2 forces came together, Captain Johnson singled out the leader of the Confederates and dashed at him for a personal encounter. Both drew their revolvers, preferring them to the saber, and a duel between them took place in the very midst of the melee of plunging horses and clashing sabers, crackling pistols and shouting men. Johnson was shot in the arm, and McGee wounded in the chest so grievously that he was erroneously reported to have been killed, although he survived. The counterattack held McGee's force until Union reinforcements could secure the battery, and the Arkansas cavalry fled, having taken heavy casualties. Jenkins writes that Confederate Brigadier General M. Jeff Thompson, in his official reports after the battle, mentions his charge as one of the events of the day that turned the tide of the battle most disastrously against Price and his men. Seeing his advantage, Curtis ordered a general attack. Pressed on all sides, Price's army fell into full retreat, setting fire to the prairie in order to create a smokescreen to cover their withdrawal. The Daily Missouri Republican reported, the battlefield exhibited evidence of the fierce contest. The enemy had fled in such haste that he had been forced to leave his dead and many of his severely wounded. The Union vigorously pursued Price, and he was eventually only able to return to Texas with less than half of his troops. Involving more than 30,000 troops, with each side taking casualties of around 1,500, the Battle of Westport was the largest battle of the U.S. Civil War to be fought west of the Mississippi River, and as Price's defeat represented the end of Confederate ambitions in the Trans-Mississippi, it has been called by many historians the Gettysburg of the West. But the Civil War on the Western Border, a publication of the Kansas City Libraries, argues that the Battle of Westport was actually more decisive than the Battle of Gettysburg. After Gettysburg, Lee and his army were able to retire in order and continue the fight, whereas Price's Army of Missouri virtually disintegrated after their defeat at the Battle of Westport. The battle was also notable for its participants. Scout James Hickok would become better known as Wild Bill. Private William Cody would later receive a Medal of Honor as a scout during the Indian Wars and would earn worldwide fame as Buffalo Bill. Frederick Benteen would famously serve with George Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. John Jeremiah Johnson would become a legendary mountain man whose story was popularized in the 1972 film starring Robert Redford. In addition, 4 officers, 3 Union and 1 Confederate, who fought at the battle would go on to serve as state governors, and 4 would serve as members of the United States Senate. Sterling Price, himself of course a former state governor, fled to Mexico rather than surrender at the end of the war, eventually returned to St. Louis, passed away in 1867. While it might have distracted some Union troops that otherwise might have been sent to the east, Price's expedition to Missouri is generally considered to have been a total failure that accomplished little and dashed one of the Confederacy's last hopes for success. While Price himself made many mistakes in the campaign, it was perhaps his undisciplined army that did him in the most. They spent so much time looting both Union and Confederate sympathizers that they turned the local population against them, and it slowed his advance. Had he moved more quickly, he might have been able to take St. Louis or Jefferson City before Rosecrans could muster his defense. In fact, Price's army might have held off the Union at Westport had they not stolen George Toman's horse. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.